And we are back live at the National Book Festival here in Washington, D.C. This is day one of 2 days of coverage. The book festival is now expanded to 2 days, and BookTV will be live both days. If you'd like to see our full schedule, go to booktv.org, and we're pleased now to be joined here on our BookTV set with Rajiv Chanrasekaran, an associate editor at the Washington Post, and most recently the author of this book, Little America, about the war in Afghanistan. But, Mr. Chandrasekaran, where did the term Little America come from?
Little America came from this remarkable project in the 1950s, led by a team of American engineers to develop parts of southern Afghanistan to dig irrigation canals, build dams in the very same terrain that the current troop surge is unfolded in. Back then, these American engineers decided to build a model town for themselves, right smack dab in the middle of the desert in Helmand Province. It was 8 square blocks, 4 blocks by 2 blocks. Instead of traditional Afghan homes with big tall walls around it, they built suburban-style American homes, ramblers with white stucco walls, manicured front lawns. They had the country's first and only co-ed high school. They built a swimming pool where boys and girls could swim together, and a clubhouse where there were nightly card games, weekly square dances, and a bartender who'd pour a mean gin and tonic. Afghans looked at this town, which the American engineers thought would serve as a model for what the Afghans might aspire to build for themselves. Of course, the Afghans said, "That's fine for you Americans, we don't really want to live that way." But the Afghans came up with a name for it. They called it Little America. And that's where I got the title of the book from, because that grand development experiment, which really failed to achieve its goals back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, in many ways was a parable of sorts for the grand nation-building efforts our country has engaged in over there over the past decade. So I start my book with the story of Americans in Afghanistan 6 decades ago to set the stage for a discussion of the troop surge.
Well, the subtitle of your book is The War Within the War in Afghanistan. Yeah. What do you mean by that?
Because there wasn't just a war unfolding on the ground in Afghanistan. As our government decided to surge more forces in there to adopt a new strategy for trying to stabilize the country, I discovered that all of the key organs of our American bureaucracy actually wound up fighting with one another. We had wars within the Pentagon. You would think that if you were sending more troops to Afghanistan, those troops would go to the places that were most critical, the places that the Taliban were seeking to take over, the places that were most at risk to insurgent gains and potentially a takeover of that country. Instead, we wound up sending the first wave of new forces to a part of the country with relatively few people. And I discovered the answer was simply tribal rivalries, not in Afghanistan, but in the Pentagon. It turned out that first wave of troops were U.S. Marines, and they wanted to bring their own helicopters, their own logistics units, and so they didn't want to work with U.S. Army soldiers in the areas in and around the city of Kandahar. And here was this tale of our own services fighting with each other instead of fighting in common purpose against the enemy. And the stories go on. There was internal fighting within the State Department, within the U.S. Agency for International Development. In one other tale I recount in some detail in the book, we had some real serious infighting between President Obama's own national security team and senior people at the State Department over the whole question of, was it wise to try to broach potential peace talks with the Taliban? And we wound up spending 18 months fighting with one another in Washington as opposed to uniting in common purpose to try to achieve the president's goal in the country.
Who is Summer Koish, or Koish?
Summer Koish, yeah. So she is a young American woman who, and there she is on the bottom right there, who had extensive foreign development experience and put her hand up to go out to Afghanistan to try to rebuild the country, to work for the U.S. Agency for International Development. And she thought that she'd be out there able to work with Afghans, try to to pursue projects that would be helpful to both the Afghan people, but would support the overall American strategy for trying to stabilize the country. The problem was that when she got out to Kabul, she was essentially a prisoner on the giant U.S. Embassy compound. She couldn't get authorization to drive out and about in Kabul, was restricted in terms of her ability to meet with the Afghans, found herself asked to sort of sit in an office building and a cubicle, much like she could have been in Washington, drafting memos and cables, as opposed to really getting out and doing the sort of development work she wanted to do. And she provides this wonderful insight into just how our surge of civilians that were supposed to go there and help rebuild the Afghan government, how that surge was squandered because most of those people wound up sitting in this fortified embassy compound doing paperwork as opposed to getting their fingernails dirty out in the field trying to do the difficult work of building government, providing meaningful reconstruction assistance to the Afghan people.
Rajiv Chanrasekaran, it's just announced that the surge is over. All those troops were down to 68,000 Americans in Afghanistan. How much was spent? What grade would you give it?
I'd give the surge a C minus, or maybe even a D. I'm not sure if a C minus means it sort of technically passed, and in my book, it wasn't a pass; it was a failure. And before I explain why, I should note that we probably spent about $250 billion on the surge. We spent $100 billion there last year, about $100+ billion the year before. When you add it all up, the troop surge has cost us north of about $250 billion there, an enormous, enormous amount of money at a time when we're facing real economic crisis here at home. Look, the idea was that we would send in more forces. They would help to stabilize broad stretches of the country so we could train up the Afghan army, rebuild the Afghan government, and that we'd finally succeed in doing what we should have done back in 2001 and 2 when, unfortunately, we took our eye off the ball in Afghanistan to invade Iraq. The problem was, by 2009, the situation in Afghanistan was simply too far gone. And we naively assumed, for instance, that President Hamid Karzai and his government would be partners with us. They were far from partners. They were working at cross purposes. The neighboring nation of Pakistan. We assumed in announcing the troop surge strategy, and I say we, I'm saying the U.S. government, that the Pakistanis would crack down on those sanctuaries. They never did. The Taliban are still allowed humongous amounts of freedom of movement in neighboring Pakistan. We assumed that the Afghan military would stand up and really take charge of security in areas. Well, as we've seen from news reports seemingly every day, Afghan soldiers are now focused on shooting American troops in many cases as opposed to defending their country. And so we've just had a pretty horrible turn of events there. Has security improved in some areas? Yes. I want to be very clear on that. When we send our men and women in uniform to places, they will do good things. And security has gotten better in pockets of southern Afghanistan. But will those gains be sustained? Will the Afghans be able to take the baton from our troops as they come home? Those surge forces that have come home this summer, the additional troops that likely will come home next year and the year after, will the Afghans really do what's necessary to make the blood and treasure that we have expended there been worth it? I don't believe so.
Rajiv Chanrasekaran is our guest. He is now an associate editor with the Washington Post. This is his second book.
That's right.
Little America, his first, Emerald City, about Iraq. 202 is the area code. You can see the numbers there on the screen, divided by time zone. So if you'd like to participate in our conversation, go ahead and dial in now. And we will begin with a call from Hunter in Loveland, Colorado. Hi, Hunter.
Yeah, I was wondering if he thought the reasons for the war was an establishment of a democratic government or more of a Western capitalist economic system.
Well, certainly when the Taliban was overthrown in 2001, the Bush administration wanted to build a more democratic government in Afghanistan. Now, it's certainly not hard to get more democratic than the Taliban, who have no great love for democracy. And the government that has been created there is